He shoved her against the courtroom bench, handcuffs biting into her wrists, sneering that people like her didn't belong in his town. He thought she was just another defenseless target. He had absolutely no idea he had just assaulted the new chief of police. The karma is absolutely legendary. The heavy oak doors of courtroom 4B in the Oak Ridge Municipal Courthouse swung open, letting in a draft of air that smelled of stale floor wax and nervous sweat. It was a typical Wednesday morning, which meant the docket was entirely choked with minor offenses, traffic violations, and the kind of petty misdemeanors that kept the city's legal machinery grinding. Sitting in the very back row of the gallery, completely removed from the anxious chatter of defendants and tired public defenders, was a woman. She wore a modest, tailored navy blue suit layered under a simple beige trench coat. Her hair was pulled back into a neat, professional bun, and her posture was impeccably straight. In her hands, she held a thick, leather-bound journal, and a silver fountain pen glided across the pages as she meticulously documented everything she saw. Her name was Cynthia Hayes, but to the citizens of Oak Ridge, she was a ghost at least for the next 3 days. Cynthia had just been appointed as the new chief of police for the entire Oak Ridge Metropolitan District, personally headhunted by Mayor William Thompson to clean up a department drowning in corruption, excessive force lawsuits, and systemic prejudice. She was a highly decorated former deputy superintendent from Chicago, known for her sharp intellect, unyielding discipline, and a zero-tolerance policy for rogue cops. Her official swearing-in ceremony wasn't until Monday morning. Until then, she had decided to spend her week out of uniform, visiting the most problematic precincts and courthouses in the city to see exactly how her officers behaved when they thought no one important was watching. Down in the well of the courtroom, Officer Bradley Miller was currently putting on a show. Miller was a 15-year veteran of the 12th Precinct, a man who wore his badge not as a shield for the public, but as a crown for himself. He was heavily built, his uniform stretched tight across a barrel chest, and he moved with the swagger of a man who believed the law didn't apply to him because he was the law. Miller had a notorious reputation. Just last year, the city had quietly settled a $250,000 lawsuit regarding the Jameson incident, where Miller had fractured a young black teenager's jaw during a routine traffic stop. Thanks to a fiercely protective police union and a spineless former chief, Miller had faced zero disciplinary action. He routinely targeted minorities, weaponizing minor infractions to harass citizens who didn't fit his narrow, bigoted view of who belonged in his city. Miller sat in the witness stand, smirking as he testified against a young black college student over a disputed resisting arrest charge. He leaned into the microphone, his voice dripping with condescension, as he spun a narrative that completely contradicted the physical evidence, knowing full well the overworked public defender didn't have the resources to fight him. From the back row, Cynthia's pen scratched furiously across her journal. She noted Miller's badge number, his aggressive body language, his blatant perjury, and his smug demeanor. She noted the tired resignation of the defense attorney and the bored expression of the prosecutor. This was exactly the kind of rot she had been hired to excise. As the judge concluded the hearing ruling in favor of the prosecution, largely due to Miller's unchallenged testimony, Miller stepped down from the stand. He puffed out his chest, hooking his thumbs into his duty belt, and turned to walk down the center aisle of the courtroom. That was when his eyes locked onto the back row. The gallery had mostly emptied out, leaving only a few people waiting for the next session. But Miller immediately zeroed in on Cynthia. He saw a black woman sitting alone, writing in a notebook, watching him intently. To a man like Bradley Miller, an observant minority was an inherent threat. His mind immediately jumped to the worst conclusions. She was a local activist, an auditor, or perhaps a relative of the kid he had just helped convict, plotting some sort of revenge. He despised people who watched him. He despised being held accountable. His lip curled into a sneer. He altered his path, his heavy boots echoing on the wooden floorboards as he marched deliberately toward the back of the courtroom. The air in the room seemed to shift, growing suddenly dense as Miller closed the distance. Cynthia didn't look away. She kept her eyes locked onto his, her expression entirely neutral. She didn't flinch, didn't shrink, and didn't look down. This lack of submission instantly infuriated Miller. In his world, people like her were supposed to avert their eyes when he walked by. "Can I help you with something?" Miller barked, stopping at the end of her row, his hand resting casually but menacingly on the butt of his taser. "No, thank you," Cynthia replied, her voice smooth, calm, and perfectly modulated. She clicked her pen closed and set it on top of her journal. "I'm doing just fine." Miller's eyes narrowed. He stepped into the aisle, closing the distance, so he was towering over her seated figure. "You've been scribbling in that little book for the last hour. You taking notes on my testimony?" "I am observing the proceedings of the court," Cynthia stated simply. "It is a public space." "I asked you a question," Miller said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying a dark, threatening undertone. "Who are you with? You one of those watch the police agitators? Because we don't tolerate that kind of nonsense in my precinct." Cynthia looked up at him, studying his face. She noted the flushed skin of his neck, the hostility in his eyes, the aggressive stance. "I am a private citizen, officer, and I am simply exercising my right to sit in a public courtroom. I wasn't aware that required an affiliation." "Don't get smart with me, lady," Miller snapped, looking around to ensure the judge was occupied. "This courtroom isn't a hangout spot. If you don't have business here, you need to leave. Now." Judge Arthur Harrison banged his gavel at the front of the room. "The court will take a 15-minute recess," the elderly judge announced, standing up and shuffling toward his chambers. The bailiff, Deputy Greg O'Connor, began locking the side doors, leaving only the main public entrance open. The declaration of a recess gave Miller all the cover he needed. As the few remaining lawyers and clerks filed out into the hallway to grab coffee, Miller stepped directly in front of Cynthia, physically blocking her path to the aisle. "Court's in recess," Miller said, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "That means it's time to clear out. Move it." Cynthia remained comfortably seated. She crossed her legs and looked at him with an unwavering gaze. "The courtroom remains open to the public during a recess, officer. I prefer to stay right here." Miller's face flushed a deep, angry red. He wasn't used to being defied, especially not by a black woman. His ego, fragile and entirely dependent on his badge, was violently bruised by her calm refusal to obey his arbitrary command. "Listen to me very carefully," Miller hissed, leaning over the wooden bench so his face was only inches from hers. "You don't know how things work in this city, girl. I give an order, you follow it. Let's see some identification. Right now." "No," Cynthia replied firmly. Miller blinked, genuinely taken aback. "Excuse me?" "I said no," Cynthia repeated, her voice projecting clearly into the quiet, mostly empty courtroom. "I have not committed a crime. I am not suspected of committing a crime. Under the law, I am under no obligation to present my identification to you simply because my presence offends you." "You're loitering," Miller shot back, grasping at legal straws. "And you're acting suspicious. That gives me reasonable suspicion. Now hand over your ID before I drag you out of here for interfering with police duties." "Sitting quietly in a courtroom gallery is not loitering," Cynthia countered, reciting the law with chilling precision. Furthermore, the Oak Ridge Municipal Code strictly defines interfering with an officer as a physical obstruction of an active duty, which I am not doing. I suggest you step back, officer, and reevaluate your current course of action. The word girl, the aggressive posture, the blatant misuse of the law. Cynthia was documenting every single violation in her mind. Miller wasn't just a bad cop. He was a walking liability, a lawsuit waiting to happen, a predator hiding behind a piece of tin. "You think you're a lawyer?" Miller sneered, his anger boiling over into blind rage. "You think you can come into my courthouse, disrespect me, and quote the law to me? You people are all the same. Always think you're above the rules. You people." The coded racism hung in the air, thick and toxic. "I know exactly who I am, officer," Cynthia said softly, her eyes turning to steel. "The question is, do you?" "I don't care who you are," Miller barked. He reached out and snatched the leather-bound journal right off Cynthia's lap. "Let's see what you've been writing about me, huh?" That was the breaking point. Cynthia stood up instantly. Despite her average height, she suddenly seemed to tower over the room with sheer commanding presence. "Return that to me immediately," she demanded, her voice echoing like a whip crack across the wooden pews. "That is private property. You do not have a warrant, you do not have probable cause, and you are currently committing an illegal seizure." "Oh, now she's aggressive," Miller laughed, a loud, ugly sound. He held the journal out of her reach, waving it mockingly. "We got a hostile one here. You know what? I'm officially detaining you for disorderly conduct." "Disorderly conduct requires a disruption of the public peace," Cynthia stated, her voice icy and lethal. "The only one raising their voice and causing a disturbance in this room is you." "Shut your mouth!" Miller roared. He dropped the journal onto the floor, deliberately stepping his heavy boot onto the leather cover, grinding it into the dirt. Then, he lunged forward and grabbed Cynthia's left arm, his thick fingers digging painfully into her bicep. The physical contact was sudden, jagged, and violently unprovoked. When Officer Bradley Miller's heavy black leather boot ground down into the spine of Cynthia's pristine journal, it wasn't just an act of property damage. It was a desperate, territorial display of power. He wanted a reaction. He needed her to scream, to cry, or to swing at him anything, to validate the narrative playing out in his prejudiced mind. When that failed, his calcified arrogance pushed him over the edge into outright criminality. He lunged forward with the grace of a blunt instrument. His massive, calloused hand clamped down brutally on Cynthia's left bicep. His fingers, thick as sausages and entirely devoid of restraint, dug past the fine wool of her tailored navy suit and pinched the muscle underneath with enough force to instantly leave a deep, blossoming contusion. He yanked her forward, a crude tactical maneuver designed to throw a suspect off their center of gravity and send them crashing chest first into the hard, unforgiving ridge of the wooden gallery bench. He expected the frantic, flailing panic of a civilian suddenly subjected to state-sanctioned violence. Instead, he encountered a physical response that completely short-circuited his bully's brain. Cynthia Hayes did not flinch. Drawing on 3 decades of elite tactical training, advanced defensive tactics, and an ironclad psychological discipline forged in the toughest precincts of Chicago, she instantly neutralized his momentum. She didn't pull away, which would have triggered a primal tug of war. Instead, she seamlessly yielded to the direction of his pull, pivoting her hips, dropping her center of mass by a fraction of an inch, and firmly planting her low-heeled shoes into the linoleum floor. She absorbed the kinetic energy of his assault without moving an inch past where she intended to stop. She was a brick wall, disguised in a tailored trench coat. She slowly turned her neck, ensuring her spine remained perfectly straight, and locked her dark, piercing eyes entirely on his flushed, sweating face. The air in the courtroom seemed to instantly crystallize. "Officer," Cynthia said. Her voice did not raise a single decibel. It dropped into a register of pure, concentrated, terrifying authority, a tone that had commanded SWAT teams and silenced riotous crowds. "You have just laid hands on an innocent citizen without a shred of lawful justification. You are currently committing battery under the color of law. I am giving you one opportunity to remove your hand from my person. Do it now." For a microscopic fraction of a second, the sheer, undeniable weight of her command penetrated Miller's rage. He hesitated. The absolute, chilling lack of fear in her eyes was profoundly unnatural to him. Bullies require oxygen in the form of terror. Deprived of it, they suffocate. But the fleeting moment of clarity was quickly drowned out by his fragile masculinity. There were 2 civilian clerks lingering in the hallway, peering through the frosted glass of the double doors. And Bailiff Greg O'Connor was stationed at the front of the room, his hand hovering uncertainly over his radio. Miller realized he was on stage. If he backed down from a black woman in a business suit now, his reputation in the 12th precinct would be permanently shattered. "You are under arrest," Miller suddenly roared, his voice cracking slightly with a strange, panicked adrenaline. He twisted her arm forcefully, wrenching it up behind her back in a painful hammerlock. "Stop resisting. Stop resisting right now." It was the classic cowardly refrain of a rogue cop manufacturing a struggle for the benefit of any nearby microphones or witnesses. "I am completely and entirely compliant," Cynthia projected, her voice ringing out like a polished bell, expertly designed to bounce off the vaulted ceilings and reach the ears of everyone in a 50-foot radius. "I am not resisting. My hands are relaxed. My feet are planted. I am simply stating for the permanent record that this is an unlawful arrest, devoid of reasonable suspicion or probable cause." Furious that she was maintaining control of the narrative, Miller ripped his handcuffs from the leather pouch on his duty belt. The metallic shing of the chains echoed sharply. He shoved his forearm into the center of her back, slamming her chest against the polished oak of the pew. The impact knocked the breath from her lungs in a sharp hiss, but she clamped her jaw shut, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a groan. Miller dragged her right arm behind her back with excessive force, crossing her wrists at an unnatural angle. He slapped the cold, heavy steel of the cuffs onto her skin. He didn't just close them. He aggressively squeezed the double bars, ratcheting them down as tight as they would go. Click, 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 click. The metal teeth bit viciously into her wrists, instantly pinching the delicate nerves and cutting off the circulation to her hands. A sharp, radiating pain shot up her forearms, but her expression remained an impenetrable mask of stoicism. "You have the right to remain silent," Miller growled directly into her ear, his hot breath smelling of stale coffee and chewing tobacco. He gave the chain a cruel upward yank, forcing her to stand on her tiptoes to relieve the agonizing pressure on her rotator cuffs. "And if you have half a brain in that head of yours, you'll start using it." At the front of the well, Deputy O'Connor could no longer pretend to look away. He hurried down the center aisle, his heavy boots thudding against the floorboards, his brow furrowed in deep, uncomfortable confusion. O'Connor knew Bradley Miller was a massive liability. Everyone in the courthouse knew it. But the unwritten code of the badge usually kept O'Connor quiet. This, however, was crossing a terrifying line, arresting a well-dressed, middle-aged woman simply for sitting during a recess was so blatantly illegal it made O'Connor's stomach turn. "Brad! Hey, Brad, hold on a second, man," O'Connor called out, raising his hands in a placating gesture. He looked at Cynthia, seeing the deep, angry red lines already forming where the metal dug into her wrists, and gave her a deeply apologetic wince. "What exactly is going on here? What did she do?" "She's refusing lawful orders, loitering with intent, and causing a massive disturbance." Greg Miller puffed his chest out, sweating profusely but trying to sound official, as he kept a tight, white-knuckled grip on the handcuff chain. He gave Cynthia another rough, completely unnecessary shove toward the aisle. She got aggressive and belligerent when I asked for a simple ID check. Probably got an outstanding warrant out of state. I'm taking her down to holding for processing. "Brad, she was just sitting there taking notes," O'Connor pleaded quietly, stepping closer, desperate to de-escalate his rogue colleague. "Are you absolutely sure you want to do this right now? The judge is going to be back on the bench in less than 2 minutes. Let's just walk her out to the street." "I don't give a damn about the judge," Miller scoffed loudly, blinded by his own toxic ego. "I police the security of this courthouse, not him. This kind of trash needs to learn how to respect the badge in my city." Cynthia turned her head slightly, locking eyes with the bailiff. "Deputy O'Connor, please mentally log the exact time, the tightness of these restraints, and the officer's explicit admission that he is arresting me to teach me respect. You are now my witness to a felony civil rights violation." O'Connor swallowed hard, his face turning pale. Before he could formulate a response to the terrifyingly articulate woman in custody, the heavy, brass-handled wooden door behind the judge's elevated bench swung open with a loud, ominous creak. "What in the name of God is going on in my courtroom?" The booming, thunderous voice of Judge Arthur Harrison silenced the room so completely that you could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights. The elderly, distinguished judge stood at the top of the steps, his black silk robes billowing around him like a storm cloud. He had stepped out of his private chambers early, drawn by the undeniable sounds of a physical altercation. His sharp, bespectacled eyes immediately fell upon Officer Miller standing in the aisle, and then, slowly, shifted to the black woman standing beside him, her arms pinned backward by steel chains. "Your Honor?" Miller immediately barked, reverting to his courtroom persona, entirely confident that the legal system he manipulated daily would instantly back him up. "I caught this woman casing the courtroom and acting highly suspicious. When I asked her to vacate during the recess, she became violently hostile and combative. I was forced to physically restrain her for the safety of the court. I'm taking her down to the precinct for booking right now." Judge Harrison slowly, deliberately descended the 3 wooden steps from his bench. His eyes were fixed with a terrifying intensity on Cynthia's face. The judge was a 30-year veteran of the Oak Ridge legal system. He was a cornerstone of the city's political elite. He attended all the high-level, closed-door city council meetings. More importantly, he had been at the highly exclusive private dinner just last Thursday night, hosted by Mayor William Thompson, specifically held to welcome the incoming police administration. Judge Harrison stopped at the wooden partition, dividing the well from the gallery. He reached up with a trembling hand and adjusted his glasses. The healthy, ruddy color began to rapidly, violently drain from his face, leaving him looking as pale and stricken as a man who had just watched a ghost materialize in the center aisle. "Officer Miller," Judge Harrison said. His voice was no longer booming. It trembled slightly, stripped of all its previous authority, replaced by a hollow, ringing terror. "Tell me you did not just place those handcuffs on that woman." "She was actively resisting, Your Honor," Miller insisted, his thick brow furrowing in confusion, utterly oblivious to the judge's sheer panic. "She's a menace. She thinks she knows the law. Shut your mouth, you utter, miserable fool," Judge Harrison hissed. He stepped right up to the partition, leaning over the wood, staring at Cynthia in absolute, unadulterated horror. Cynthia Hayes stood tall, squaring her shoulders despite the excruciating pain radiating from her bounded wrists. She looked the terrified judge dead in the eye and gave a slow, deliberate, incredibly grim nod of her head. "Good morning, Judge Harrison," Cynthia said calmly, her voice echoing perfectly in the dead silence. "It seems your court security is quite proactive." "What is she talking about?" Miller thought, his brain stalling. He glanced back and forth between the terrified, ashen-faced judge and the stoic woman he had just violently assaulted. A cold, heavy stone of pure dread suddenly detached itself from his ribcage and dropped straight into the pit of his stomach. Judge Harrison looked at Miller, his eyes wide, conveying a mixture of profound pity and explosive rage. "Officer Miller," the judge whispered, the complete silence in the courtroom making his quiet voice sound like a deafening thunderclap. "Remove those handcuffs. Immediately." "But, Your Honor, the liability." "I said remove them," Harrison roared, his face suddenly turning a violent mottled purple, spit flying from his lips. "Do you have any earthly idea what you have just done? Do you have any idea who you just assaulted?" Miller froze completely. The small silver handcuff keys, sitting in his pocket, suddenly felt like they were glowing white-hot, burning a hole straight through his uniform trousers. He slowly turned his head and looked at Cynthia. He really looked at her for the very first time. He saw the impossibly expensive cut of her suit. He saw the perfect, unyielding military posture. And he saw the absolute, terrifying calm in her dark eyes, the look of an apex predator who had just let a trap snap perfectly shut. "Judge," Miller stammered, his thick throat suddenly drier than sandpaper, his 15 years of bravado entirely evaporating into thin air. Who is she?" The silence that fell over courtroom 4B was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. It was the kind of silence that precedes a devastating storm. Officer Bradley Miller stood frozen in the center aisle, his hand still gripping the chain of the handcuffs binding the woman he had just violently assaulted. He looked at Judge Arthur Harrison, searching for the punchline, for the reassuring nod that this was all a misunderstanding. But the judge's face was ashen, his hands gripping the edges of his wooden bench so tightly his knuckles were stark white. "Judge," Miller repeated, his voice cracking, the false bravado entirely stripped away. "Who is she?" Judge Harrison swallowed hard, his eyes darting to the bruised wrists of the woman in custody. "Officer Miller," the judge said, his voice dropping to a horrified, gravelly whisper, "you have just handcuffed Cynthia Hayes. She is the newly appointed superintendent of the Oak Ridge Metropolitan Police Department. She is your commanding chief." The words hit Miller with the physical force of a freight train. For 3 excruciating seconds, his brain completely short-circuited. He stared blankly at the woman. He processed the perfectly tailored Navy suit, the unyielding posture, the piercing, intelligent eyes that were currently dissecting him with the clinical detachment of a forensic pathologist. The rumors that had been swirling around the 12th precinct for weeks suddenly slammed into his reality. Mayor William Thompson had recruited a hardliner from out of state to clean house, a highly decorated disciplinarian, a woman. Miller's stomach violently plummeted into his boots. The color rushed out of his face, leaving a sickly, sweaty gray in its wake. His thick fingers, which had just moments ago aggressively twisted her arm, suddenly sprang open, as if the metal handcuffs had turned to molten lava. Chief Hayes," Miller stammered, stumbling backward a step. I didn't know. Ma'am, I had no idea who you were. You were out of uniform, and you were just sitting there." "And that, Officer Miller," Cynthia Hayes said, her voice ringing out through the dead silence of the courtroom, crisp, even, and terrifyingly calm, "is precisely the problem." Miller's hands began to shake. Panic, raw and unfiltered, clawed at his throat. "I'm sorry, Chief. I am so sorry. It's a misunderstanding. Let me just—" He frantically dug his hand into his duty belt, fumbling for his handcuff keys. "Let me get these off you right now, ma'am." He stepped forward, reaching out toward her bounded wrists. "Do not touch me," Cynthia commanded. She didn't raise her voice, but the sheer, compressed authority in her tone struck Miller like a physical blow, stopping him dead in his tracks. He froze, his hands suspended in midair holding the silver key. "You have already committed battery," Cynthia stated, her eyes locking onto his with lethal precision. "Do not aggravate the charge by touching me again." Cynthia turned her upper body slightly, addressing the stunned bailiff who was still standing paralyzed near the front benches. "Deputy O'Connor, I believe you are the bailiff of this court?" "Yes, ma'am." "Yes, Chief," O'Connor stuttered, snapping to attention, sweat beading on his forehead. "You will approach Officer Miller," Cynthia instructed smoothly. "You will confiscate his handcuff keys. You will then come behind me and unlock these restraints. You will handle the cuffs by the chain only, as they are now evidence. Do you understand?" "Yes, Chief," O'Connor said quickly. He practically sprinted down the aisle, snatching the keys out of Miller's trembling hand. Miller didn't resist. He looked completely hollowed out, a bully utterly dismantled by the sudden presence of a higher power. O'Connor stepped behind Cynthia, his hands shaking as he carefully unlocked the ratchets. The heavy metal cuffs fell away with a sharp clack. Cynthia brought her arms forward slowly. She did not rub her wrists. She simply turned her arms over, exposing the deep, angry red indentations and the broken skin where the metal had bitten into her flesh. "Deputy O'Connor," Cynthia said, holding her wrists out, "I want you to visually inspect these injuries. They were inflicted post-compliance during an unlawful detainment. You are my witness." "I see them, Chief," O'Connor swallowed nervously. Cynthia finally turned her full attention back to Bradley Miller. The disgraced officer looked like he wanted the floorboards to open up and swallow him whole. "Chief Hayes, please," Miller begged, his voice high-pitched and desperate. "I was just doing my job. We've had security issues in the courthouse, sovereign citizens, agitators. I was just trying to secure the perimeter during recess. I didn't mean any disrespect to you." You did exactly what you meant to do, Cynthia replied coldly. She stepped over to where her leather journal lay in the dirt, the footprint of Miller's boot stamped clearly across the cover. She pointed to it. Deputy O'Connor, please bag that journal. That is also evidence of destruction of private property. She stepped back into the aisle, closing the distance between herself and Miller. She didn't crowd him, but her presence was overwhelmingly dominant. Let us be absolutely clear about what just happened here, Bradley Miller, Cynthia said, dissecting him with the law. You did not stop me because I was a threat. You stopped me because my presence bruised your ego. You bypassed reasonable suspicion. You ignored the legal threshold for probable cause. You initiated an unlawful Terry stop based purely on a personal vendetta against an observant citizen. Chief, I am speaking, Cynthia cut him off, the air in the room dropping 10 degrees. When I invoked my constitutional rights, you escalated to violence. You committed assault under the color of law. You committed battery. You committed false imprisonment. And you did it all in broad daylight, in a court of law, in front of a sitting judge. Title 18, United States Code, Section 242, Deprivation of Rights under Color of Law. It is a federal offense. Miller's knees physically buckled. He grabbed the edge of the wooden pew to keep from collapsing. Please, he whispered, tears of sheer panic welling in his eyes. I have a pension. I have 15 years on the force. Please don't do this. I am not doing anything to you, Cynthia said softly, mercilessly. You did this to yourself. You simply made the fatal mistake of choosing a victim who had the power to fight back. How many citizens sitting in this exact courtroom didn't have that power, officer? How many people did you bully, assault, and falsely arrest because they didn't have a badge to hide behind? Judge Harrison remained completely silent, watching the brutal, clinical dismantling of a man who had treated his courtroom like a personal fiefdom for years. Bradley Miller, Cynthia announced, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. I am formally stripping you of your police powers, effective immediately. You are terminated from the Oak Ridge Metropolitan Police Department. Miller let out a strangled gasp, burying his face in his hands. Furthermore, Cynthia continued, turning to the bailiff. Deputy O'Connor, you are a sworn officer of the county. I am ordering you to place this man under arrest for assault, battery, and false imprisonment. O'Connor hesitated for only a fraction of a second before his training took over. He pulled his own handcuffs from his belt. Officer Miller, turn around and place your hands behind your back. You can't do this, Miller suddenly yelled, taking a step back, a desperate, cornered animal. I'm a cop. I'm protected by the union. You can't just come in here and arrest me. You were a cop, Cynthia corrected him, her gaze unwavering. Now, you are simply a suspect, and if you resist, Deputy O'Connor, I will personally add a resisting arrest charge to your jacket. Turn around. The fight completely drained out of Miller. The reality of his situation crushed whatever was left of his arrogance. Slowly, agonizingly, he turned around and placed his hands behind his broad back. The sound of O'Connor's cuffs, clicking shut, echoed like a gunshot in the silent courtroom. The sight of Bradley Miller doing the perp walk through the hallways of the 12th Precinct was a seismic event that permanently altered the landscape of the Oak Ridge Police Department. He wasn't brought in through the back alley sally port. Chief Cynthia Hayes personally escorted the handcuffed Miller through the front double doors of the precinct, walking him straight past the front desk, the dispatch center, and the crowded bullpen. Dozens of officers, detectives, and sergeants stopped dead in their tracks. Phones went unanswered. Conversations halted mid-sentence. They watched in absolute stunned silence as their untouchable, loud-mouthed veteran was marched toward the holding cells by the new superintendent, a woman whose name they had only read in memos. Miller kept his head down, his face burning with a humiliation so profound it seemed to radiate off him in waves. He was booked, fingerprinted, and photographed by a painfully silent booking sergeant. The mugshot of Bradley Miller, eyes red, face swollen with crying, stripped of his uniform shirt, would soon become the most famous photograph in the city. The fallout was immediate and spectacular. Richard Cobb, the aggressive and politically connected president of the local police union, stormed into Chief Hayes's temporary office 3 hours later, threatening strikes, lawsuits, and political warfare over the unlawful termination and humiliation of his officer. Cynthia didn't argue with him. She didn't raise her voice. She simply swiveled a laptop monitor around to face Cobb and pressed play. It was the high-definition security footage from Courtroom 4B. Cobb watched in horrifying silence as Miller harassed, grabbed, and violently handcuffed a perfectly calm, seated woman. He watched Judge Harrison's horrified reaction. He listened to the crisp, undeniably clear audio of Miller shouting racial dog whistles and openly admitting to making an arrest based on disrespect. When the video ended, Cobb was pale and sweating. The Federal Bureau of Investigation's Civil Rights Division is already reviewing that tape, Mr. Cobb, Cynthia said, folding her hands neatly on her desk. District Attorney Thomas Sterling has already drafted the indictment. I suggest you decide very quickly if your union wants to spend its political capital defending a man who commits federal crimes on camera. Cobb stood up, straightened his tie, and cleared his throat. The union respects the investigative process, Chief. He walked out of the office and never returned Miller's desperate phone calls from the county jail. 6 months later, the karma came full circle in the most poetic way imaginable. The trial of the state versus Bradley Miller was held in the Oak Ridge Municipal Courthouse. Because of the high-profile nature of the case and the jurisdictional requirements, it was assigned to the largest room available, Courtroom 4B. Miller sat at the defense table, not in his crisp, intimidating blue uniform, but in a baggy, shapeless, county-issued orange jumpsuit. He looked 10 years older. He had lost weight, his barrel chest deflated, his posture hunched and defeated. Across the aisle sat District Attorney Thomas Sterling, who had built an ironclad case entirely devoid of plea deals. The star witness for the prosecution was Chief Cynthia Hayes. She took the stand in her full-dress uniform, 4 gold stars gleaming on her collar. She testified flawlessly, recounting the events with terrifying, objective precision. The defense attorney, Sarah Jenkins, barely cross-examined her, knowing that trying to shake the credibility of the chief of police who had the whole incident on tape would only enrage the jury further. But the hardest blow of karma was the man sitting high above them all, wearing the black robes. Judge Arthur Harrison had refused to recuse himself from presiding over the trial. He had been a witness, yes, but he was also the judge of that specific courtroom, and he had a point to make. When the jury returned a guilty verdict on all counts aggravated assault, false imprisonment, and battery under color of law, Miller wept openly at the defense table. "Mr. Miller, please stand," Judge Harrison ordered, his voice echoing with the booming authority that Miller had once relied upon to terrorize innocent people. Miller stood, his legs trembling, flanked by 2 bailiffs. "For 15 years you wore a badge that represented public trust," Judge Harrison said, staring down at the broken man. "Instead of protecting the vulnerable, you preyed upon them. You operated under the delusion of absolute power, believing that the law was a weapon designed solely for your own amusement and prejudice. You brought shame to this courtroom, and you brought violence to a woman who simply refused to bow to your bigotry." Judge Harrison picked up his gavel. "The irony is not lost on me that you are standing in the exact spot where you committed your crimes. It is the judgment of this court that you be remanded to the custody of the State Department of Corrections for a period of 5 years, with no possibility of early parole. May you find the humility in a prison cell that you so deeply lacked on the streets." Bang! The gavel fell, sealing Miller's fate. He was led away in handcuffs, walking the exact same aisle he had dragged Cynthia down months prior. Chief Cynthia Hayes didn't smile as she watched him go. She didn't gloat. She simply closed her leather-bound journal, tucked it under her arm, and walked out of the courtroom. She had a department to run, and Bradley Miller was just the first piece of trash she had swept out the door. The message to the rest of the city was crystal clear. The days of untouchable cops were over. Accountability had arrived in Oak Ridge, and she wore 4 stars on her collar. If this story of brutal, real-life karma and absolute justice got your blood pumping, hit that like button right now. Don't forget to share this video with anyone who loves seeing a bully get exactly what they deserve, and subscribe to the channel for more incredible, dramatic stories of justice served cold. Drop a comment below. What would you have done in the chief's shoes?